Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to do a concept show. Rather than looking at one of my games or some of your games, we're going to take a look at a theme in chess. So I'm going to start off by giving you three positions to look at, to think about. Take your time, take as long as you like. Of course, you'll want to pause the video so that way you don't hear my answers, but let me show you the positions, and then we'll come back and take a look at how each of those games proceeded. So the first one we'll take a look at, this is the starting position, and it's black to move here. Okay, white just played f3 to restrain black's central majority, so you can stop it here. I'll flip the board for you if you prefer it this way, and you can figure out what black to move ought to do. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. Alright, in this game, okay, it's going to be white to move this time. And here's the position, white to move. Kind of a classic modern Benoni type of situation. Alright, so work this one out as best as you can. And then on to the third example. And here it's again white to move, and this is the position. So again, kind of a Benoni-like position. This was actually from a sort of Blumenfeld gambit, kind of a, well, it was a Blumenfeld with bishop to g5. Anyway, white to move here. What should you do? So take your time on all three of these, and now I'm going to go back to the first example, and we'll see the theme in action. Okay, so once again we start from here. This is the game Hermann Pilnik against Efim Geller, or Yefim Geller, from the Gothenburg Interzonal in 1955, quite a while ago. And as I said, white played f3 here. So this was a Najdorf, so we can go back a little bit. Sorry, it wasn't a Najdorf, it was a classical variation with bishop to e2. And can kind of quickly zip through this. So with knight to d5, this is what set up the pawn structure that we saw, where the players have majorities on opposite sides of the board. Okay, so Geller plays this very nice blocking maneuver on the queen side, making it very hard for white to get his majority rolling in any meaningful way. And, well, it's still pretty hard for white to make the queen side work. And now that that's been more or less put under control, black sets about making his majority count. Okay, a4 is a nice move, prevents bishop to a4. Okay, and so now black is certainly considering e4, followed perhaps by trading bishops, putting a knight on e5, and so on. So white plays f3. And what does black do here? Well, what black does in this position is to play e4 anyway. And the point of this is that black is going to achieve this beautiful dark square domination in the game. Now, if white plays f takes e4 straight away, then bishop takes c3 is going to lead to the same sort of situation, except that white's queen side will be pretty lousy. So Pilnik swaps and then plays f takes e4. Okay, well now what does black do? You might think queen takes b2. I'm going to grab that weak pawn over there. The a2 pawn will be under attack, and I'll get to have some pressure maybe on that side of the board. Maybe that could be played, maybe not, but much, much better. If queen takes b2, e takes f5 becomes very, very murky. Actually, it looks probably pretty good for white. But leaving that aside, it's irrelevant to black's aim. Black plays f4. And this is sometimes called, not often, but it used to be called the sweeper sealer twist. So this e4 move kind of sweeps the pawn ahead, and it after f takes e4 happens, then f4. And so this is the sealer. And what's meant by that is that now white is kind of locked in. So this pawn on e4, see before, okay, let's go back again to this position. Here this bishop looks alive. Okay, it's biting on these g6 and f5 pawns, so it doesn't have maximum scope certainly, but it doesn't look like such a bad piece. But once black has played f4, and then after this next move, okay, rook f2, knight e5, now it's evident that this bishop on c2 is rather a disgraceful piece at this point. So it's absolutely shut in by, well, mostly by his own pawns, but also the pawn on a4 is playing a small further role. And, well, what is white to do? See, it's perfect for black. Black has achieved this in a position where he has dark square dominance, that's just obvious, while white has no pieces that can fight for the dark squares, or at least fight for the dark squares directly. The bishop on c2 can't at all, and of course white doesn't want to sacrifice his queen for the knight or anything like that, and the rooks can't get at the knight. Well, how about the pawns? What's going on there? White has a majority, two majorities. He has a queenside majority, and he has a central majority. The bad news is that the queenside majority is not really very impressive. It's going to be very difficult for white to make anything of that. The central majority, forget about it. It would be better, in fact, if he didn't have a central majority. If you got rid of either the e4 or the d5 pawn, white would be better off than he is now. Well, that leaves one majority, and that's black's majority on the king side, ignoring the e4 pawn, which I'm counting as a center majority. So on the H, G, and F files, black has an extra pawn, and he's going to be able to use that. So watch what happens. Okay, rook d to f1, queen h4, rook f7, just very calm. Time has no meaning here. Black can just make moves, improve his position. White gets to watch and applaud. He can, clap to show how impressed he is by what black is doing. But as far as putting up actual resistance, that unfortunately is not really possible. White might consider queen h3, but black takes and then takes on c4, and then white will be worse on all three parts of the board. So he played h3, h5, g4, just very, very simple chess. Here, white tries a small combination before he just gets obliterated with f3. So he tries this little trick, and now g3. But black has many ways to deal with this. Okay, I don't know, maybe not many ways, but certainly more than one. At least two completely crushing ways to deal with this. Perhaps the simplest way is queen takes h3, and on gf just to play g3, followed by queen h2, g2, g1, wins. Even if queen e3, black still ends up a queen ahead after all of that. But what he played is good enough too. He played knight f3 check. Okay, now if bishop takes f3, queen g3, rook f3, and g takes h3, black has a pretty quick forced mate with rook e3 or rook to d3, but he doesn't need it. I mean, just take twice on g2 and you're up a rook for nothing. So that's completely hopeless. Okay, king f2 is what was played. Queen takes h3, and now g3 check. So the same idea that I mentioned before, but a little more involved. Okay, king takes f3, g2 check, king f2, and now black has only one move that's any good. Only one move wins. And in fact, not only wins, but anything else would just be completely lost. But the one move is enough. Queen h2. So g1 is going to be a double check, and the only way to prevent this is with queen to g3, but you just trade queens and promote the pawn, end up a queen ahead. So white had enough here. Game over. All right, on to the next example. This is the game Jonathan Penrose against Mikhail Tal from the 1960 Olympiad in Leipzig. And we start here. So Tal had a fantastic, he'd been on a fantastic run, basically for his whole career. I mean, he had won a couple of Soviet championships, won the interzonal, won Zurich 59, won the candidates, won the world championship match, and was destroying everybody in the Olympia as well. So this was finally a small Waterloo for him. So Penrose, who's British IM, didn't become a GM, but could easily have done so. He was a very, very strong player, certainly a GM by contemporary standards. Was a correspondence chess grandmaster, and also I think is the brother of the famous mathematician slash physicist Roger Penrose. So, and Penrose himself, I think, had a fine career in science. So, a very impressive individual, and in this game is a very impressive chess player. Well, you might guess from the previous game, and if you did, you'd be right, that white's move here is e5. This is a thematic move, and again, it's very good. You can see in this position that black has some, definite pressure on, both on the queen side and in the center as well. I mean, he'd like to play b4, and, if you can, even just win the e4 pawn, or maybe even play bishop c3, although that's riskier. and then take on e4. So it's not so easy for white to really prevent black from making progress on the queen side either. I mean, b5 has been achieved, b4 is coming, but white can make his own breakthrough in time. So e5, d takes e5, and now again this this sealer move, f5. This threatens to open up the f file to good effect. White also has ideas like d6 in some cases, sometimes just to put a knight on e4. So black played bishop to b7, not fearing f takes g6 yet. White played rook a to d1, overprotecting the pawn on d5 against any b4 tricks, and also preparing in many cases to play d6. Bishop to a8. Here white probably doesn't make the best move, but it's not a bad move, and it's certainly thematic. So let's not worry too much about the details. We want to see this concept in action. It's a very effective idea. So knight c to e4. Imagine back here that black does not have a pawn on e5. In that case, the queen would be from c7 would reach to g3, might have some access or some influence there. The bishop on g7 would have its diagonal reopened and exert some pressure that way. Maybe in conjunction with b4, might be able to take the b2 pawn and have two connected passed pawns on the queen side. If there's no pawn on e5, the black knights could use the e5 square. And if there's no e-pawn at all, as there wasn't before e5, then the rook on e8 would have a very usable file. So we can see that this pawn on e5 is far from an asset for black. In fact, it's a bit of a liability. I mean, it shuts down at least 4 black pieces. Prevents at least 4 black pieces from really operating to their full efficacy. So white is very happy to just keep this pawn in place where it shuts down, where it seals in, again, the sweep or sealer twist, it seals in most of black's army. All right, well, black could play better than he did here. He played knight to a4, trying desperately for counterplay on the queen side, and Penrose had a very simple and yet completely powerful solution to this problem. He plays bishop takes, plays f takes g6, he checks on f7, and then he plays knight to c5, and black is just completely lost at this point. Not only does white threaten to take the knight on d7, he also threatens to play knight e6, hitting the queen, and threatening queen takes g7 mate. So black found nothing better than queen to a7, and after these exchanges, black was just completely lost. He does have 2 pawns for the piece, and they're passed, though not connected, but really white had very little trouble finishing the game. So knight to b6 forks those 2 pawns, and okay, the rest is very simple. I think the game only continued because of maybe time pressure issues. So Penrose went on to win a few moves later in quite convincing fashion. Okay, example 3. So we start here, and this is the game Chernin, Alexander Chernin, and against Anthony Miles, played in the Tunis Interzonal in 1985. All right, so once again we have a Benoni kind of position, and once again it's e5 that comes to the rescue. Not for black, but for white. Although here, white's advantage isn't perhaps as big as in the other cases, but black's position is pretty precarious. So he's not losing after this, but he has the characteristic difficulties that we've seen already. A little bit of a different flavor this time. First of all, there's no open f-file, and so in the first example, white had this, or well, it was black in that case, but the sacrificer had this nice kingside pawn storm, which simply blew the opponent off the board. And likewise in the last game too, white had this powerful play on the f-file. Well, we don't have that here, but what we do have is white getting, first of all, a very powerful grip on some of these light squares, and also the d6 pawn, well, the d5 pawn, which can go up to d6, is also quite a powerful unit. So let's see what happens. Well, first of all, it's worth considering what happens on queen to e7. And here we have an interesting bit of analysis that seems to be refuted by the engines. So Chernin, in his old notes 25 years ago, suggested e6 and gave the following variation as clearly better for white. So he stopped here. Now, the variation seems to be reasonably plausible, but it looks as if it's his assessment is mistaken. Material is even at this point. Certainly white has very good control over the light squares, and the pawn on e6 looks quite attractive. But it's hard to see how exactly white makes direct progress anyway. One clear idea is to play knight h4 followed by knight to f5 or knight to g6. So black's best move then is to play g5. And after g5, it's not clear at all how white is better. Black is going to continue with bishop to g7. Okay, so first of all, g5 stops knight h4. The bishop on g7 is beautiful, and it shows that it's not only white who gets to have a nice diagonal for his bishop. And then he plays king e7. If bishop to d5, he always has rook to c8, no big deal. And black seems to have equal chances here. Okay, so that doesn't seem all that compelling. However, white has much better than e6, and it's good that he does because it in fact is, again, altogether thematic. You should play knight to c4. So this is the kind of thing we expect in a modern Benoni in general anyway. So this knight is just beautiful there. And black can't play bishop takes f3 because of knight takes d6 check. I mean, this is too strong. So d takes e5, knight f takes e5, and black's position is atrocious. I mean, the only thing that he's got going for him is that white's king hasn't castled yet, but there's no way for black to exploit this. If he plays f6, for instance, then d6, he doesn't even need to do that, but it's good. Queen e6, queen g6 check, king d8, and now queen takes g4. And the point of d6 is to draw the queen to e6, where it's now under attack. So if queen takes g4, knight takes g4, white keeps his extra piece, game over. So rook to a7 might be a better try, but all right, this is not really impressive either. Bishop to d3, and now if f6, okay, the queen can't jump to g6, but check, queen e4. Okay, if bishop c8, knight f7 is winning. So takes. Let's say queen f6, and white just develops, finishes his development. And black's position is horrible. All of white's pieces are better than all of black's pieces. White's light square domination is evident. The e5 pawn is kind of weak. So white has a position that's it's winning. Maybe black doesn't need to resign here, but definitely white should win this. Okay, so after e5, Miles took the pawn, and now knight to e4. So again, it's not that he wants to win the pawn back, he's locking black in here. But this one is a little bit less cookbook than the previous examples. All right, well, what does black do here? If he plays queen f5, he loses on the spot to h3, because once this bishop moves anywhere other than h3, which is silly, then knight to d6 check, and we pick off the queen. So black played queen to f4, knight f to d2. Okay, black's up a pawn, and white seems to have no threats, but white has more or less permanent control over the light squares. So the knight's great on e4, he's going to bring a piece to c4, the bishop will go to d3, and black's minor pieces are pretty much locked in. So again, we have they're sealed in. The knight on d7 or the knight on b8, okay, it can go to d7. From there, maybe it can go to f6, and at best it just gets traded off, and white puts another piece on e4. The bishop on f8, of course, is just shut out of the game, and black's light squared bishop is not a bad piece, but it's going to be neutralized by white's pieces. Okay, so black played bishop to f5 here. He could play h5. This is suggested by Helston just to get the queen out of danger, but white regains his material with a terrific position. So Miles played bishop to f5. White just plays bishop to d3. And the idea is a very typical one. One I've mentioned, I think, many times, which is that when your opponent has a weak color complex, so here black has real problems with the light squares, c4, e4, c6, perhaps someday f5. If black were to play f5 going for activity, e6 becomes a potential target. Well, since black has this weak color complex, it makes very good sense for white to try to swap off the pieces that can defend that complex. So remember we saw in the first game where black made the sacrifice where he had this very great knight against white's just worthless light squared bishop. So again, there white had no pieces that could fight for the dark squares. Well, here it's the other way around. This time it's black who's trying to hold on to his light squares, and so white would be very happy to trade off the light squared bishops. Well, it turns out that black really can't do very much that's useful against his plan, so he simply made the swap himself to get rid of one of white's very good knights rather than the bishop. So as nice as white's bishop can be, white's knights were even more capable, perhaps, of utilizing the light squares. So takes, knight to d7. Here, perhaps, Chernin made an inaccuracy. Probably was best for him simply to castle, allowing f5, and now there's some very nice little tactics that really demonstrate how powerful white's control over the light squares can be. So start with g3. Now, what does black do? His queen only has 2 squares. If he goes to f3, then knight to d2, followed by bishop takes f5. And that's obviously really, really bad for black. If queen to g4, f3. Okay, if queen to h3, then knight to f2, followed by bishop takes f5. So we've seen that already. On queen to h5, what now for white? Well, the answer is g4. So white's using everything to fight for the light squares. And, okay, if the queen goes to g6, then the knight simply retreats, and then bishop takes f5, or maybe knight takes f5, is devastating. If queen f7, well, again, knight to g3 is pretty good. Maybe even g takes f5 is okay, but all right, knight to g3 is clearly the obvious move, or even knight to d2. Okay, finally, if f takes g4, white to move and win, knight f6 check. So forks the queen and forks the queen. So black gets to choose which minor piece does the dirty deed, but not whether one does. All right. So castling would have been better, but g3 was okay. Queen g4, h3, queen h5, and now a very good move, d6. This prevents black from developing the bishop, but more to the point, it opens a new diagonal, another light square diagonal, which is going to once again pose all sorts of problems. Finally, one other point to d6 is that it blocks the bishop's defense, the black bishop's defense of the c5 pawn, so that if f5, white has knight takes f5. So again, more torture on the light squares. If rook to c8, bishop f5 decides, followed by bishop to g6 check. And if rook takes c5, bishop takes d7 check, and then queen takes c5. So you can see, I mean, all these light squares, whether it's a knight or a bishop or the queen, white is able to take advantage time and time again. So black refrained from pushing the f-pawn and played queen to g6. Now, white could play knight takes c5. There's nothing wrong with this, but he prefers to keep the position as much under control as possible and plays rook to d1. So if bishop takes d6, the white can play, among other things, just knight takes d6. Well, I'll show you. Bishop d6, knight d6, queen d6. Bishop f5 is crushing. Probably there are other good ways to win too, but that's more than good enough. Okay, so black tried b3, and okay, maybe black could get a little bit of activity after queen takes b3, f5, but still lost. But white played queen to e2, again keeping control, and we'll see the idea here in a moment. Okay, black played f5. So he might be thinking, okay, finally, at last, I'm getting a little bit of play. The knight moves. Maybe I can play e4 soon afterward, or of course play bishop takes d6. But white finds a rather cruel rejoinder here to black's bid for play. See if you can figure out what it is. Well, once again, g4. Very nice move. So he's not going to let black keep this little squadron of pawns side by side. He's going to force the f-pawn to move and to give up its control over the light squares. If f takes e4, bishop e4 with a fork. See the rook in the corner is hanging as well as the queen. So Miles played c4. Of course, this changes nothing. Bishop to b1. And okay, here if you were to play something like rook to c8, then white can play either the obvious knight to g3, which is also winning, or maybe even better, knight to c3, which brings the knight to new directions, which can also be quite fruitful. Either way, white's winning. So black just played f takes g4, and now after queen takes c4, we see that black has problems on both diagonals. So there's the a2 g8 diagonal, so there's this one, and there's this one. And black can't finish his development. I mean, the bishop on f8 is still stuck. Castling queenside is illegal, and it would be pretty bad even if it were legal. The rook on h8 is not getting into the game either. The knight on d7 more or less has to stay there to prevent this pawn from going even further. So it's horrible. Black tried queen f7, queen c6. White regained his pawn, and white's not even down any material here. Okay, black played g6. He's got to try to get the bishop into play somehow, and maybe move his king to a better square. But he's too slow. Knight c5, and now, among other things, white has the idea of playing bishop e4 d5. So once again, still another diagonal. So black has problems on this diagonal, and this diagonal too. So black tried rook to g8. Of course, white plays bishop to e4. So if black is going to line up his goodies to be shish kebabbed, then white's going to take advantage. All right, bishop to g7. And white doesn't even bother with bishop to d5 here. Plays knight takes a6, threatening knight c7. Okay, black plays queen f4. An active move, but not one that he's going to like. So knight to c7 check. Okay, he can't go to f8 because knight e6 forks the king and queen. Queen c4. Okay, again, king f8, knight e6 here. And Chernin finished with knight to d5, which was good enough. Black resigned. He loses his queen. But knight to d5 check was only the second best move on the board. He had mate in two, and in a way it's a pity he didn't do this because it again shows the light square dominance in full display. So this would have been a very nice way to finish the game, mating with the queen on a light square with black's poor king suffering more or less from start to finish here. So a great game by Chernin, and again a very thematic game. Got to see this this typical pawn sack idea in action once again, e5 and knight to e4. So the first one sweeps open it clears the line for the knight, and the knight in turn seals the position up so the black's pieces can't function with any real efficiency at all. And after that, we saw a very convincing play by white, taking advantage of all the weak light squares in the black camp. So beautiful game, and really all three games were very, very nice, very instructive, and I hope you enjoyed them too. So thanks a lot, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.